Imagine you're a political strategist with the power to redraw your state's electoral districts. You have the tools and data to shape these districts in a way that almost guarantees your party's majority in them for the next decade, regardless of actual voter preferences. Here's the ethical dilemma. Is it fair or democratic for you to use your skills and resources to engineer electoral outcomes, ensuring your party's dominance? Or should the principles of democracy always prioritize fair and competitive elections, even if that means risking your party's control? Where, in other words, should we draw the line between strategic political maneuvering and the fundamental democratic principle of fair representation? This is the central question at play in the issue of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering refers to the practice of drawing or manipulating the boundaries of electoral districts with the goal of granting one party or group an unfair electoral advantage. Gerrymandering occurs most frequently in first-past-the-post electoral systems like those used in the United States. Gerrymandering takes two primary forms. Cracking refers to gerrymandering with the goal of diluting the voting power of competing political parties by dividing their supporters across a number of electoral districts, thereby denying them a sufficiently large voting bloc in any particular district to elect their preferred candidates. The 35th Congressional District in Texas is often used as an example of cracking. The district stretches from Austin to San Antonio, connecting parts of cities with a narrow strip of land along Interstate 35. The design was allegedly intended to crack the urban, typically Democratic voting populations, diluting their voting power in what might otherwise be a more competitive surrounding district. By spreading the urban voters thin across multiple districts, their influence in any single district is minimized. The second type of gerrymandering is referred to as packing. Here, the goal is to concentrate the voters of one political party into a single district, letting them win that district by a tremendous margin, but reducing their voting power in other neighboring districts. Prior to the court-mandated redistricting in 2017, North Carolina's 12th Congressional District was a good example of packing. It was drawn in a long, thin shape along Interstate 85, packing African-American voters into the district to reduce their influence in surrounding areas. Indeed, the Supreme Court ruled in its 2017 decision in the case of Cooper v. Harris that the district was an unconstitutional violation of the Equal Protection Clause, as it was drawn with the purpose of concentrating black voters into a single district. The court ordered that the district boundaries be redrawn in a race-neutral manner. We can see the problem of gerrymandering play out more clearly in a hypothetical example. Let's say that this image represents a state with 10 electoral districts. In total, there are 1,000 citizens or voters who are equally divided between red and blue. A relatively simplistic analysis might conclude that in an evenly divided state, the two groups should each win about half of the available seats, say, like reflected here. Each party would win 5 of the 10 available seats in the geographic districts that were concentrated, or we could draw the electoral boundaries like this, creating 10 extremely competitive districts. But what if we were more creative? What if we drew the boundaries like this? In this map, we still have 10 electoral districts, and we still have a population that's evenly divided between red and blue. But what's the outcome of this kind of electoral map? A large number of red voters are concentrated or packed into a single district, with the remaining red voters being divided or cracked between the remaining districts. As a result, blue has a distinct political advantage, gerrymandering them to win in 9 of the 10 electoral districts, despite the fact that there are an even number of red and blue voters in the state. And this kind of dynamic plays out in the real world. In Wisconsin, the Republican-controlled state legislature engaged in an aggressive gerrymandering after the 2010 census, restructuring the state's electoral districts such that in the 2018 election, Republicans won just 46% of the vote statewide, but still won 63 of the 99 seats available in the state's assembly, nearly two-thirds majority. 4 years later, in the 2022 election, the electorate as a whole was fairly evenly divided, with the Democratic governor winning re-election by a little more than 3 percentage points. But Republicans easily retained control of the state legislature, winning 64 of the 99 seats in the state assembly and 22 of the 33 seats in the state senate. But this is hardly a new process. Indeed, the term gerrymander itself dates to the efforts of Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who in 1812 drew the electoral districts in Massachusetts for his party's political advantage. Gerry was a member of the Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and a precursor to the modern Democratic Party. and the electoral district boundaries he drafted for state senate were intended to give his party an unfair advantage in upcoming elections. The district boundaries were criticized in political cartoons of the day, stating that the boundaries looked like a salamander or gerrymander. But the unfair boundaries were politically effective. Despite the fact that Gary's Democratic Republicans lost the popular vote, losing the control of both the governorship and the Massachusetts House to the Federalists in the election of 1812, they held on to the Massachusetts State Senate thanks to Gary's map. Indeed, much like the Republican gerrymandered districts in Wisconsin today, Gary's Democratic Republicans were able to win 29 of the 40 seats in the state Senate despite losing the popular vote. The problem of gerrymandering continues through today. In part, gerrymandering is a function of the fact that the number of seats in the House was legislatively limited at its current 435 members by the Reapportionment Act of 1929. Prior to that, the size of the House was regularly increased in response to the growing U.S. population. In 1790, the House had just 65 members. At the same time, the total U.S. population was about 3.7 million people, meaning that the average House member had about 57,000 people in their district. Over time, the number of representatives increased more slowly than the population was growing. Nevertheless, from 1789 until 1910, the size of the House was regularly increased to accommodate growth in the U.S. population. When the size of the House was capped at 435, there were about 200,000 people per representative. Today, that figure stands at about 750,000 per representative, one of the highest ratios in the democratic world. But because the size of the House is fixed, it's necessary to reallocate or reapportion seats in the House after each census, with states that grow gaining new seats and states that do not losing seats. Following the 2020 census, for example, Texas gained 2 seats, Colorado, Florida, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon gained 1 seat each, while California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia lost 1 seat each. And this continued a long-standing trend of migration and thus reapportionment away from the so-called Rust Belt in the Northeast and towards the Sun Belt in the west and southwestern U.S. We see that in the 2010 reapportionment as well. And each of these reapportioned seats provides an opportunity for gerrymandering. But even as legislatures use gerrymandering to try and draw new districts that give their party an advantage in electoral politics, there are some legal limits on how far they can go. In Buckley v. Carr, 1962, the Supreme Court established that the question of redistricting was justiciable under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, meaning that courts could hear cases and provide relief for claims of gerrymandering as it prevented equal representation in the legislative branch. 2 years later, the court issued its decision in Reynolds v. Sims, ruling that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment required state legislative districts be roughly equal in population, a principle that was later extended to the U.S. House of Representatives, ensuring that districts have equal populations to provide equitable representation and reinforcing the one-person, one-vote standard at state and federal levels. Beyond the general principle, the government has generally approached racial gerrymandering and political gerrymandering under different frameworks. In Shaw v. Reno, the Supreme Court ruled that race cannot be the predominant factor in creating electoral districts except under very narrow circumstances, a decision that aimed to prevent both the dilution of minority votes and the creation of districts based solely on racial considerations. And Section 2 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act prohibited voting practices or procedures that discriminated on the basis of race, color, or membership in a linguistic minority group. This includes gerrymandering that dilutes the voting power of racial or ethnic minorities. The Act also included a section in Provision 5 that required certain jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination to receive federal approval called preclearance before changing voting laws or redistricting, with the goal of ensuring that any changes did not harm minority voting rights. However, this provision was nullified by the Supreme Court in its decision in the 2013 case of Shelby County v. Holder. But the courts have been much less willing to address the question of political gerrymandering. In Davis v. Bandemer, the Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering could be justiciable under the Constitution, but the plaintiffs failed to provide a reliable standard for determining when partisan gerrymandering is unlawful, a conclusion they reiterated in the case of Veith v. Jubileer. But in Rucho v. Common Cause, the Supreme Court reversed this position, ruling that claims of partisan gerrymandering present political questions beyond the reach of the federal courts and were therefore non-justiciable, effectively closing the door of the federal court challenges to partisan gerrymandering and leaving the issue to state courts and legislatures. As a result, some states have adopted constitutional reforms or court decisions to limit gerrymandering. These include the establishment of independent redistricting commissions and stricter criteria for drawing district boundaries. For example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court invalidated the state's congressional maps under the state constitution, leading to a redrawing of the map that was more favorable to competitive elections. And in California, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, and Montana, independent, nonpartisan redistricting commissions take the power of redistricting away from political parties and their leaders. To avoid illegal gerrymandering in the United States today, redistricting must adhere to several requirements and principles, many of which are derived from the Constitution, federal laws, and a series of court decisions we just considered. As established by the one-person, one-vote principle in landmark cases like Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims, districts must have roughly equal populations to ensure equitable representation. This requirement is for both congressional districts and state legislative districts. Under the Voting Rights Act, redistricting must not dilute the voting power of racial and linguistic minorities or be drawn with the intent to discriminate against them. Racial gerrymandering cases are subject to strict scrutiny and can be struck down if they do not serve a compelling government interest. Districts must be contiguous, meaning that all parts of the district are connected at some point. This requirement is meant to ensure geographic integrity, avoiding districts that are spread out and non-cohesive. While the definitions can vary, generally districts should be compact, meaning they should not be oddly shaped or spread out unnecessarily. Compactness is sometimes used as a measure against gerrymandering, although it's not strictly defined in law. Redistricting should, where possible, respect existing political subdivisions like counties and cities, recognizing communities of interest, ensuring that like-minded populations are kept within a single district to accurately represent their interests. Finally, many states have their own additional criteria which might include further restrictions on partisan gerrymandering, requirements for public input, or the use of independent commissions. State Supreme Courts can and have adjudicated gerrymandering cases based on state constitutional law. While these criteria are designed to limit gerrymandering, the enforcement and interpretation of these principles can vary significantly. For example, after the Rucho decision, the battles against partisan gerrymandering increasingly moved to state-level courts and legislatures. Additionally, with technological advancements and increasing political polarization, the challenges and strategies of gerrymandering continue to evolve, as do the methods to combat it. As such, maintaining legal and ethical standards in redistricting is an ongoing challenge that requires vigilance and often reform. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.